A diver went looking for a lost mule cart in a quiet Florida sinkhole. What he found instead should not have been there at all. A stone wall deep underwater, built in a place that may have been dry before history began. In the spring of 1987, a cave diver named Daniel Kessler went down into a flooded limestone shaft 11 miles east of High Springs, Florida, on a Tuesday morning in the last week of April. He was 34 years old. He was a former Navy diver. He ran a small airfill station out of a cinder block building beside the Santa Fe River. He had been hired by a retired citrus grower named Otis Puett to survey a sinkhole on the back 40. That sinkhole had swallowed a mule cart sometime in the 1920s and had never been properly measured. Kessler expected dark tannin water, a silt floor, and maybe the rusted frame of the cart. From the surface, the sink looked ordinary. It was a round dip, maybe 40 feet across, ringed with live oak and covered in duckweed. It was the kind of place a person could drive past 100 times and never once wonder what was under it. What he found at 91 feet, past a squeeze so tight he had to take off his tank and push it ahead of him, was a chamber the size of a small barn. At the far end of that chamber, standing upright out of 6 inches of soft mud, was a wall. It was not a ledge. It was not a pile of fallen ceiling, which is what a wall-shaped feature in Florida limestone is supposed to be. Kessler's light found a face about 14 feet long and a little over 6 feet high. It was built from fitted limestone blocks stacked in 5 even courses. The joints were so tight his dive knife would not fit between them. He ran a hand along the top course and felt a shallow groove cut the full length of the stone. It was about 1 inch wide. It was worn smooth, not chipped. It felt like the kind of wear left by centuries of something being dragged or drained along it, not by one single cut. Behind the wall, through a gap where one block had slipped, the chamber kept going into darkness. His line did not reach that day. He surfaced, sat on Puett's dock for 11 minutes without saying a word, and then asked to use the telephone. What Kessler called first was not the state. It was not a newspaper. He called a hydrogeologist he had worked with twice before on cave mapping jobs. Her name was Carol Iversen. She was 39 years old and worked at the University of Florida's Water Institute. She had spent the previous decade mapping the conduit systems of Florida's aquifers for the Regional Water Management District. Iversen drove up from Gainesville that same afternoon, looked at Kessler's photographs on his kitchen table, and made 2 phone calls of her own before she entered the water the next morning. Her field notes from that dive still exist. They are 4 handwritten pages in a spiral notebook she carried on every survey, saved for years by a colleague after she left the university. They add one detail Kessler had not mentioned. Behind the gap in the wall, her light caught a second structure, a low platform or bench running along the far side of the chamber. Resting on it, untouched and coated in fine gray silt, the kind that settles on anything left alone underwater for a very long time, was an object she described only as a worked stone bowl. Its rim was chipped in one place, otherwise it was whole. Iversen's notebook from that week is not complete. The colleague who saved the folder only noticed the gap later, when he sat down to organize her papers after she left the state. By itself, that gap is easy to explain away. Except, it sits exactly where the missing part matters most. Her entries run without a break through the Monday before the dive. Then they start again on the Friday after it, 4 days later. The 3 days in between, the day of Kessler's first dive, the day she drove up from Gainesville, and the day of her own dive into the chamber, are simply gone. These were not blank pages left for later. They were removed. The stubs where 3 sheets had been torn free were still visible along the spiral binding. And when the notebook picks back up on Friday, it says nothing about Cutter's sink at all, as if the notebook itself had been edited to skip the one event that made those pages worth keeping. The geology is what makes the wall hard to dismiss as a strange little accident. It matters because the date is the whole argument. North Florida sits on a karst platform, limestone laid down when the peninsula was still a shallow sea. That limestone dissolves the way karst always does, along joints and bedding planes. That is what creates the sinks, springs, and cave passages the region is known for. Dissolution caves have rounded shapes, undercut walls, and collapsed debris piled at random angles, because gravity does not stack broken stone in neat courses. What Kessler and Iversen photographed was the opposite of that in every way. There were 5 level courses of shaped stone. There was a groove worn by use, not by water chemistry. And Iversen's own tape measurements showed the chamber floor was level to within 2 inches across its full width. Limestone does not build itself into fitted masonry. No natural process known in a Florida cave. Not slow dissolution, not roof collapse, not the settling of old fracture blocks, produces coursed, jointed stonework standing free of the surrounding rock. Something built that wall, and whatever built it did so in a chamber that, by every hydrological model the state has published for that part of the aquifer, has been below the water table far longer than the normal record allows for people to have been standing in Florida with tools in their hands. That claim needs real numbers. The regional water table in that part of Alachua County has been reconstructed from core samples and cave sediment analysis going back through several glacial cycles. Those reconstructions show that dry, air-filled conditions in chambers at that depth happened only during times of much lower sea level, the kind seen during full glacial maxima, when so much of Earth's water was locked in ice sheets that the ocean stood far below its modern shoreline. The most recent such window closed about 12,000 years ago, as the ice retreated and the water table rose close to where it is now. Before that, the chamber would have been dry only during the height of the last glacial period itself, reaching back past 20,000 years. Before that again, dry conditions long enough to quarry, shape, and stack limestone by hand would push into an even older glacial cycle, well over 100,000 years ago. The accepted archaeological record for the Florida Peninsula does not now go back much farther than about 14 or 15,000 years. And even that rests on a small number of Paleo-Indian sites that many researchers already see as testing the outer edge of what the evidence can support in print. A finished wall in a chamber that was last plausibly dry before that window opened is not just a wrinkle in the record. It stands outside the record, on the far side of a line nobody in the accepted timeline has bridged. Iversen did not publish. That is the second fact that matters. A hydrogeologist with 10 years of aquifer mapping work behind her does not sit quietly on a find like this by accident or modesty. What she did instead was file an internal memo with the Water Institute. It described the dive as documenting an anomalous submerged feature of unknown origin. It recommended a follow-up survey with proper photogrammetry and asked for support to bring in a qualified archaeologist before the site was disturbed again. That support did not come through the Institute's normal channels. What did come, according to the colleague who kept her folder, was a visit from 2 men Iversen never named. They spent an afternoon alone with her in a closed office and left carrying her only complete set of dive slides from the chamber. For the next 3 years, Iversen's research output changed sharply and completely away from cave systems. She published on surface water nutrient loading in the Santa Fe Basin, She published on septic contamination in unincorporated Alachua County. These subjects had no real overlap with the karst conduit work that had defined her career up to that point. She left the university in 1991 for a private consulting firm in Tallahassee. Before she left, and after she left, she gave no interview about the Puet Sink to anyone who went looking. Puet's land changed hands twice in the decade that followed. The sinkhole itself, which Kessler and Iversen had informally started calling Cutter's Sink after an old fence line marker on the property, was fenced off by the second owner, an out-of-state holding company, in 1994. The following spring, a heavy steel grate was bolted over the entrance shaft. The permit record for that grate lists the applicant as a land management firm and gives no reason beyond general liability, a phrase that covers many motives and explains almost none of them. Cave divers who had used the site informally for much of a decade were turned away without further explanation starting that same year. Some were turned away by a caretaker who would not give his name. As far as any public record shows, the chamber has not been surveyed again since Carol Iversen's dive in the last week of April 1987. And the wall at Cutter's Sink is not the only strange thing in Florida's aquifer system. That is what turns one odd dive into a pattern worth naming carefully. About 240 miles south, at Little Salt Spring near Northport, divers working with the University of Miami in the 1970s documented a sharpened wooden stake driven into the bank of a submerged basin beside the remains of an extinct giant tortoise. Radiocarbon dating placed it at about 12,000 years old. That evidence made it into the published record for one clear reason. The stake was organic and datable in a way a stacked stone wall never can be. The basin at Little Salt Spring drops in a series of shelves to a depth of more than 200 feet, and the deepest of those shelves has never been fully mapped by any team willing to put its findings into print. The site's own excavators have said for decades that they believe the spring holds much more in its lower chambers than has ever been brought to the surface. Access to those chambers has been tightly restricted since the first surveys, formally for safety, though the same safety logic could be used for hundreds of other Florida cave systems that were never fenced with the same speed or urgency. About 90 miles farther south, at Warm Mineral Springs near Northport, divers recovered human skeletal remains in the 1950s and 1960s that dated to a similar age. Those finds briefly made the site a major part of regional archaeology. Research teams came from as far away as Europe in the years right after the first recoveries. Then research access narrowed sharply in the decades that followed. The deepest basin was closed to independent divers for years at a time and reopened only under tightly controlled permit rules that few people outside academic institutions were ever granted. A 1972 survey report on the site, only 3 pages long, notes in its final line that more excavation below a stated depth was deferred, pending more funding. And surviving grant records show that nobody connected to the original team ever applied for that funding. In both places, the pattern matches Cutter's Sink in smaller form, packed into one season instead of spread over decades. A discovery pushes against the edge of the accepted timeline. A short period of real scientific interest follows. It is brief but genuine. It produces real papers and real credentials. Then the narrowing begins. It is quiet. It is procedural. It wears the language of safety and property rights. But in practice, it keeps the deepest and oldest-looking material out of reach of anyone without institutional backing, and often out of reach of the institutions too, once the digging begins to threaten what they may have to say in public. What survives from Cutter's Sink survives because Daniel Kessler did something Iversen's report never mentions, and her colleague learned only years later. On the second dive, the one during which Iversen's slides were later taken, Kessler went in first. Before Iversen ever reached the chamber, he lifted the worked stone bowl from the low platform behind the wall and wrapped it in a mesh collection bag. He never reported that recovery, not then and not later. The object was never logged with the state's Division of Historical Resources, even though Florida law says the state should have been notified about archaeological material removed from state waters or sovereign submerged lands within the district. Kessler kept it. He is 73 now. He retired from diving nearly 20 years ago after a hip injury ended his cave work for good. And the bowl, by his own account to a small handful of people over the years, sits on a shelf in a house outside Alachua, unregistered and unstudied by any qualified archaeologist. It has been photographed only once, on a disposable camera, in a print Kessler still keeps in a kitchen drawer. That print has been described by two of the very few people Kessler ever showed it to. One was a niece who visited in the late 1990s. The other was a retired dive shop customer who saw it leaning against a coffee cup on Kessler's kitchen table sometime around 2006. Both described the same object on their own. It was a shallow bowl, about 9 inches across. Its inside was worn smooth in a way neither person thought looked like weathering. Its rim was chipped cleanly on one side, as if one single blow had broken off a piece and nothing else had happened to it after that. Neither the niece nor the former customer is a geologist or an archaeologist. Neither claims to know the age of the object or the kind of stone it was cut from. But both, years apart, agreed on one thing. It did not look old the way a fossil looks old. It looked used, the way a tool looks used by hands that return to it again and again, and then stopped. In the few conversations Kessler has agreed to over the years, he has never called it valuable. He has also never offered it for testing. When asked why, the niece remembers him saying only that he had already seen what happened to the last set of photographs someone else took of that chamber, and the bowl was staying exactly where it was. It is the only piece of Cutter's sink that a steel grate and a closed office in Gainesville never managed to reach. If the geology holds, and if the wall is what 4 separate observers across 2 dives said it was, then the wall requires a builder. That builder would have been shaping finished stone inside a Florida chamber during a dry window that predates the most recent ice age by a wide margin. That builder would have been making coarse-fitted masonry with a worn utility groove that suggests repeated use over a long stretch of time, not one ceremonial act done once and left behind. This account cannot prove that claim from where it stands. It can only say that the chamber itself makes that claim in the only language a chamber has, which is shape. Otis Puett died in 1998. The sale of his land to the second owner, the out-of-state holding company that installed the grate, went through 11 months before his death. It was arranged by a nephew who held power of attorney during Puett's final illness. In the one recorded conversation anyone has been able to trace, Puett told a neighbor sometime around 1990 that he regretted ever calling Kessler in the first place. Not because of what was found, but because of how quickly people he did not recognize began asking about a piece of land his family had owned since the 1930s. He never explained who those people were, and the neighbor did not think to press him at the time. By itself, it is a small detail. It is second-hand. It is only loosely dated. Against the weight of a dressed stone wall 91 feet down, it explains nothing on its own. But it sits beside the missing pages in Iversen's notebook and the slides that left her office and never came back. It is one more gap in a record that keeps opening gaps in the exact places where the record would otherwise have had the most to say, as if the absence itself had learned where to stand. The shape at the end of Daniel Kessler's dive line in April 1987 was not a cave. Cutter's sink is still there. It is still fenced. It is still gated. It sits on land now held by an entity that has never granted an interview about why the grate went up the year after Carol Iversen's career turned in a new direction without explanation. The water table in that part of Alachua County still sits where it has sat since the last ice retreated. The chamber is still flooded. The wall is still exactly as it was found. Dressed stone stands in the dark, level to within 2 inches, waiting beyond a restriction most divers will never be cleared to pass. Behind a gap in 5 courses of stone that has not had a light shine through it in almost 40 years. If that wall is real, then someone built it before the world says they could. And it is still down there, waiting. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.